The girl who likes to photograph windows. She used to take pictures of windows, not the people or things you can see through them, but the windows themselves. If I just shoot what's on the other side, then the window has no meaning, she would say in her usual sing-song tone. It might as well be a lens filter or a pretty frame for something else. No, it is the window itself that interests me. So she would walk around New York City with a camera from her collection, or sometimes simply her phone. She would peer closely at windows of all kinds. Old windows and new windows. Ornate windows and plain ones. Windows close to the ground and windows high above. Residential windows, office windows, restaurant, cafe, and storefront windows, clean windows, grimy and smudgy windows, broken windows, graffiti-covered windows. They all fascinated her in their own way. Sometimes she would pause outside a busy restaurant and study the trim that framed a large panel of glass in the front. Diners inside would shuffle uncomfortably. Once, inside a pre-war office building on Lafayette and Grand where she had a meeting, she stared so closely at an old window that the worried janitor came up to ask if the glass needed cleaning. "Oh no, I'm so sorry. The window is fine. I was just admiring the woodwork." She had turned a little, gesturing awkwardly at the frame. "Actually, I'm going to take a picture of it," she had said as she rummaged in her tote for her phone. The janitor, eager to ensure his handiwork was seen in the best light, had then proceeded to give the panes a vigorous wipe, much to her dismay. She liked the slightly dull sheen from patches of dirt and grime on the glass. She had lived in New York City for 10 years and still frequently found herself a bit lost, but she didn't really mind. She often walked alone along long stretches of residential and industrial blocks in Brooklyn and Queens, where no tourists go. In Manhattan, she avoided the busy avenues and preferred to stroll slowly along the side streets. She would wander around the East Village on 6th Street, between 1st and A, then 7th, skirting Tompkins Square Park and all the way down to D. Then, maybe she would circle back and walk west on St. Mark's till it ended, somewhat unceremoniously, she thought, on 3rd Avenue. One time she photographed a set of symmetrical windows in a cream-colored walk-up framed with decorative stone pediments and keystones. The mass of lines of a black metal fire escape running across the facade was a nice contrast, she had thought. Her favorite windows in the East Village stood at the fork of 10th and Stuyvesant. An ivy-covered corner of a brownstone, clad in dark masonry, anchored the junction. Bay windows lined both the first and second floors, each framed in heavily weathered trim, and bordered by thick stone panels with deeply etched patterns. Wooden planter boxes rested on the sills. On other days, she waded through crowds of tourists in Soho, NoHo, and Nolita. She photographed a rectangular storefront window, set in a grey cast-iron facade and framed by square columns with decorative rosettes along the top. She took a close-up shot of an arched window set in a brick wall, bordered by heavy iron shutters painted a light terracotta and mounted on big metal hinges. She stared up, pointing her phone at a loft, painted white, the tall rectangular window bays framed with decorative columns and cornices. Sometimes the most nondescript windows attracted her. The ones on the first floors of plain-looking apartment blocks. These austere frames were set into flat walls and protected by the vertical lines of metal window guards. On one occasion, she stood in front of such a window in Hell's Kitchen. A frowning, wrinkled old face of a grey-haired lady peeked out from behind a partially drawn curtain. She had waved apologetically with an embarrassed smile before hurrying away. Later, she looked at the picture. The scene was blurry and out of focus, but the annoyance on the old woman's face, framed in the window, was clearly palpable. She had kept a print of it folded in her purse. The Romans were the first to use real glass, but it was super dull. Glass you could actually see through didn't show up until the 1600s, she told her co-worker matter-of-factly as they sat on a pile of discarded pallets, sipping watermelon juice at the corner of Canal and Essex. Before glass, people used all sorts of stuff, like they would flatten animal horns or use parchment or oiled paper to cover up windows. They even used oyster shells in the Philippines. Like actual shells. It's a very pretty-looking translucent type of oyster. I forget what it's called, she explained to her figure-drawing classmate as she bit into her samosa and took a sip of cardamom chai at her go-to tea spot in the Lower East Side. Did you know that the word window is Nordic in origin? She said to her best friend as she dug into a peach tart at her favorite Polish bakery in Greenpoint. The lady behind the counter always gave her an extra helping, unasked. It's kinda wild. It actually comes from two Norse words, she had said on a date. Vinda meaning wind, and auga meaning eye. Wind eye. Isn't that so cool? She then lifted a tangle of udon with her chopsticks from a steaming broth at her favorite Japanese place in the East Village. Her date, somewhat embarrassed to be outdone on a topic he knew nothing about, promptly began to drone on about being the founder of a very important new AI startup. She nodded absently and looked past him at the perfectly square window divided into 16 equally sized panes. The light wooden grid of vertical and horizontal strips was quietly pleasing, she had thought. Slowly she filled up her phone with pictures of windows. She filled up SD cards on her digital camera and then filled up all her hard drives. She filled up rolls and rolls of film in 35mm and 120mm and stacked boxes of Polaroids neatly under her bed. Occasionally, when the mood would strike, she would even sketch a window she liked in a little notebook, using her 0.3 micron pen. This made her look like an elegant window inspector, as she would stand perfectly still, eyebrows furrowed, furiously scribbling, glancing up at the window and then down at her notebook in a rhythmic pattern. In the summer, she wore her favorite spaghetti strap linen dress, paired with sneakers and white socks. In winter, she would continue her explorations bundled in a vintage rust-brown coat, a knit mustard yellow scarf, and a cayenne red cloche hat with a bow. One evening, a gust of November wind had blown a loose page out of her notebook, and she had run after it, one hand outstretched, the other gripping the tiny notebook and pen while holding her hat to her head. The long end of her scarf had streamed behind her like a ceremonial banner as she chased the errant page. The exposed brick wall in her small studio on Clinton Street was covered from floor to ceiling with prints of her photos in various sizes. They depicted windows and the building facades that held them in a dizzying array of shapes and colors. You rarely noticed or dwelled on what might be on the other side. She had an uncanny way of capturing windows that drew the eye to the structure itself, and you would find your gaze slowly circling the frames and the elements that held them. Her cat would frequently pause, sit on his hind legs, and consider this visual gallery with the trained eye of a cynical New York Times art critic. His bushy tail would sway lazily from side to side. The fact that he would ignore the view outside her own apartment window, simply to ponder her work for long periods, filled her with a quiet sense of satisfaction. After all, recognition is not easy to come by in this city. At the center of her wall of prints hung a large image, nearly 3 feet tall, of a sealed-off arched window. The arch was massive, almost 2 stories high, and made of dark brown, weather-beaten brick that contrasted with the newer, redder bricks used to fill in the opening. The top of the arch was rounded and lined by a second, inset row of bricks that framed the inside of the curve like a shallow lip. Below was a stone ledge and an ornate, rusted metal fence covering the square openings of basement windows. She had taken the photograph from the sidewalk outside her first apartment in New York City, a walk-up in Washington Heights. I rarely go that far uptown anymore, but I often walk the side streets in Lower Manhattan, making my way slowly from west to east, through Greenwich Village, Soho, Nolita, NoHo, the East Village, and finally down to the Lower East Side. Each time, I find myself half hoping that around the next corner I'll see her, standing in front of another window, camera in hand. The girl who likes to photograph windows. If you enjoyed this story, follow Lexicon and Flame for more original writing, exploring memory, meaning and culture across time and space.